Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to pay my respects to any elders from the Wurundjeri community or any other communities who are here with us in the room today. So first I'd like to thank RMIT for hosting us at this venue. It's like a throwback to university student days, I think, for all of us, sitting in a lecture hall. And I'd like to welcome everyone to the inaugural PIP seminar series. This seminar series was set up in light of the massive growth that we've seen in the Partners in Prevention network. When PIP started over a decade ago, there used to be sometimes 5, sometimes 7 people coming to network meetings. Now we regularly get 60, 70, 80, 100 people coming, and so we've changed the format. So the seminar series are really designed to share information, and we're really wanting to listen to PIP members and your thoughts and opinions and ideas. And what we've heard from many evaluations of PIP is that the networking time is the most one of the most important bits of the Partners in Prevention network. So we've put on a networking lunch afterwards, so I'd really encourage everyone to stick around and meet each other. There's a whole lot of new people in the room today, plus a whole lot of faces that I recognise. So please stick around and talk to the DVRC team and talk to the colleagues in the prevention space as well. So Marion Frere is the interim CEO of the Office of Prevention and Women's Equality. Over the last 20 years, Marion has worked across government, university sectors, holding strategic executive roles within human services operation, research, as well as strategic policy development. Prior to coming back to government, Marion was the founding deputy director, of the Mackay Centre for the Promotion of Mental Health and Community Wellbeing at the School of Population Health for the University of Melbourne. And we're very excited to have Marion launching the Partners in Prevention seminar series today. Thanks, Marion.
Thank you, Emily, for that lovely welcome. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. It really is a pleasure and an honour to be here today launching the PIP series. It was fabulous to hear about you just then talking about the growth in the sector, which in a way it's a practical, real thing, but it's also symbolic, I think, of the growth in our emphasis on prevention and the growth of our prevention workforce and the recognition of the specialist nature of that work and the importance of that work. So my job here today is to do a couple of things. Mostly about contextualising what's happening today in terms of broader government agendas. So I'm going to talk a little bit very briefly about the overall prevention context, so the work that happens through my office, and I'm going to also talk about respectful relationships and PIP, and kind of my goal is to kind of bring them all together for you. Before I start to do that though, I am going to kind of go back to basics and remind us why we're here. And I think I do this regularly and I think it's a really important thing because it helps us hold really close how important is the work that we're doing. You all know this, but family violence absolutely shatters lives. Physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, cultural, spiritual, and financial. That's why we're here. It's pervasive. Across Australia, police respond to calls related to family violence every 2 minutes. It's deeply gendered. At its core are relations between men and women, and it's unacceptable. We have had a really strong stand from this government over the past couple of years that it's unacceptable. And you've seen that in terms of the investment in the family violence response and also prevention. Because importantly, and this is kind of what we need to hang on to come into work every day and do our job, it's preventable. Like other big campaigns around smoking, sunblock, etc. We know that we can change behaviours and attitudes, and that's what we're here to do today. And we're quite early in this agenda, but that's why we're here. And so, that sense of enthusiasm and growth is just fabulous. And just to get a bit of a sense of the numbers, this government has committed in the May budget $50.8 million over the next 4 years to work on prevention efforts. So just to contextualise that a little bit, just really quite briefly here, in the action plan which responded to the Royal Commission on Family Violence, there's a section on prevention, and in that section on prevention there are 4 main actions. One is the development of a gender equality strategy, and that my office holds responsibility for that strategy, and it has a number of actions which go across a number of settings about growing equality and building respectful relationships between men and women. And if you want to see any of these documents, if you go to Victoria Women, all of them are quite easily accessible on the website. So that was the first action, a gender equality strategy. That's live, it was launched in December last year, and there's an action plan that underpins that. The second piece of work in prevention was the prevention strategy. That's called Free from Violence. That was launched in May this year, and it is a conceptual framework for how we act on prevention across all settings. At the moment, what we're doing in that space is building the action plan, and a lot of people in this room are involved in building that action plan. The third piece under the prevention in the Family Violence Action Plan is the establishment of a Family Violence Prevention Agency to bring together the work on prevention the prevention of family violence in Victoria. The fourth piece, so just to remind you, there's the gender equality strategy, the prevention strategy, the prevention agency. The fourth piece in that puzzle is respectful relationships and the rollout of respectful relationships. And that's where you fit across all of it, but you specifically fit in relation to supporting the work around respectful relationships in school. Importantly, when we talk about prevention and we talk about those strategies, and again, you know, why we're here and why particularly this group goes to work every day, we are very concerned about the impact of family violence on children and young people who experience or witness it. As we know, the impact is significant and long-term, and again, we can prevent it, and that's our goal. In terms of primary prevention, I'm just going to move my notes up a little bit. So thinking about our approach to primary prevention, which is what I want to take us through now, is basically the key to stopping violence before it occurs is to encourage children and young people to reject the rigid gender roles and to develop positive personal identities which enable positive relationships. You know this stuff. I mean, this is core to your work, but it's reflected in our overall approach to primary prevention. It's about strengthening the positive equal relationships between women and men, girls and boys. And to do this, when we work with children and young people, we are countering the negative peer relationships and we're building the positive peer relationships. And as you all know, again, education all the way through the system is an absolutely central key setting for achieving this. So it's about achieving it within the setting, and then the flow-on effects to all aspects of our social relations are very, very strong. A good education is much about much more than reading, writing and arithmetic. And again, that's why we're all here. It's about, you know, creating young people and children who are well able to function and take good, respectful relationships out into society. That's why the Royal Commission into Family Violence recommended the introduction of respectful relationship education into every Victorian government school, one of the clear, strong recommendations in the final report. Respectful relationships is one of the most well-established examples of primary prevention interventions, using the education system as a catalyst for that deep social change, that deep long-term social change that we're after. The Victorian Government's approach to respectful relationships goes well beyond classroom learning into the whole school approach, where partners across a range of other settings come into the education system to achieve change, teaching children to build healthy relationships, to build resilience and confidence in their identities and their ability to build positive relationships. The initiative provides targeted support to strengthen school capacity to respond, refer and support students, staff or the school community. in terms of school community members experiencing family violence. Over 1,000 respectful relationships leading and partner government schools are now signed up across the state, and that's an amazing achievement. I'm looking at my education colleague here, like 1,000 schools have signed up, an incredibly positive response to taking up the Respectful Relationships initiative. In terms of investment, 21.8 million over 2 years to roll out respectful relationships and make it part of the Victorian curriculum from prep to year 12 in 2016. What this investment does is it provides training for up to 4,000 early childhood educators and includes a $300,000 investment in the Partners in Prevention program. So if you can see, we're kind of taking it from the big picture down to where you sit and the critical nature of your work building into what is actually a cohesive, larger agenda. You're a critical piece of the puzzle. Continuing to embed respectful relationships across all of our Victorian primary and secondary schools is an absolutely key prevention strategy of this government. It has a long established history. It's one of the strongest mechanisms that we have, and the mandated rollout is a critical next step in what has been a long journey that has been a strong build in terms of changing the way that we work on this issue in an education setting. I've been emphasising a number of times the importance of the work of the Partners in Prevention Network. It's vital for ensuring practitioners have access to evidence-based information, tools, resources to support this work. And I probably can't emphasise the evidence-based enough, because one thing that we do know, when we identify what works and we have the strong evidence to support that, we're in a much better position in government to scale up and increase investment. We do often fund new innovations where we're trying new ideas, and that's a really important part of any strategy as well. But when we can slowly build a strong evidence base, we are in a much better position to know what works, to learn from it and to scale up. It's our hope that this investment will result in a well-resourced, robust and informed network of practitioners, opportunities to connect, to build, to learn, reflect, forward plan, workshop ideas, think about innovations. All of those possibilities live within this network. And just as a closing comment, I think one of the things that I really love about the prevention space. So we have the political leadership, which has been strong and quite new in terms of Victorian governments. But we've also got an incredibly strong grassroots presence in this space. This is not something that can be done alone on high. It absolutely relies on people right across the community in a range of settings. In places in their communities to work together to respond. It's an ever-changing environment. Part of that place-based approach means that you can be quite agile in terms of seeing what's happening and responding in a really local, effective way. So to close, and I hope that you've picked this up as I've been speaking, you are a very, very vital part of making this work. I'm really, really pleased that the network is growing and strengthening, and I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Thank you so much, Marion. It's incredible to see someone who's been working in prevention for almost 15 years now. It's just astounding to see the level of support and investment that's coming from the Victorian government and a range of departments around primary prevention of violence against women, which we have all been struggling for so long to get on the agenda. So we absolutely commend the Andrews government for that. In my utter excitement to introduce the panellists, I forgot to introduce myself. I am Emily Maguire. I'm the CEO of the Domestic Violence Resource Centre Victoria. I've been involved in PIP since its inception. I was initially the Department of Education's representative on the PIP advisory group when it first started, morphed into being a Partners in Prevention practitioner who benefited from the tools and resources that, at that stage, Kiri Bear, who was the Partners in Prevention project manager, was leading the work, have presented at PIP, and now I'm in the incredibly privileged position of sitting at the head of an organisation who is running this network. So it has just been, for those of you who are new to PIP, it's got a really long and very community sector focused history that we're really wanting to kind of continue to grow and build, as Marion said, and so we're incredibly thankful for the Victorian Government's support of the PIP network, and to be able to have the opportunity to work in partnership with the Education Department around supporting the rollout of respectful relationships, which is what we have all been fighting for many years. So, my first left, Pamela Bjork-Billings is the Senior Education Advisor at Our Watch. Pamela has got 20 years' experience as a teacher and a professional development lead within the school system. She has worked at Deakin University as an equal opportunity manager with a focus on both students at a university level as well as the staff, and has done a PhD in sociology looking at the cultural factors impacting on the work of female jockeys. So, a very interesting PhD topic to discuss at lunchtime. Our next panel member is Jess. Jess Boccia is a social worker who has spent 10 years within the family violence and sexual assault sectors. Her work has consisted of a range of response and prevention roles in diverse settings, and among these has been 5 years coordinating the SAPS program, the Sexual Assault Prevention Program for secondary schools within the Barwon region, and more recently being involved in the development of a primary school model. Our next speaker is Justin McDonnell. Justin is the Director of Engagement, Inclusion and Support at the Department of Education and Training, where he's responsible not only for the Respectful Relationships program, but child safety, family violence, student engagement and mental health policy. So he's a very busy man. Prior to joining DET, Justin worked in public policy roles in the WA and UK governments before spending a number of years at back in Victoria at the Department of Premier and Cabinet working in social policy. And last but not least is Helen Cahill. Professor Helen Cahill is the Director of the Youth Research Centre at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. She has extensive expertise in wellbeing education, and she is the person who led the development of the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships teaching and learning materials, which are being used in schools, in the 1,000 schools that Marion was talking about, who are rolling out respectful relationships education across the state. So can I ask you all, panel members, welcome, to each in turn respond to a question about what respectful relationships education looked like whenever it was that you started working in this field.
Well, 35 years ago, when I started working in this field, this work was called a whole lot of other things. It was called equal opportunities for girls and women. It was called equity for students and all sorts of other things. The main differences then were, well, the similarities were we had a whole of school model. We didn't have the strength in the curriculum materials that we've got now, specifically directed to this work. We were working with teachers in schools to develop their own, particular to each school. We did have strong level of government support. We had resources located in regional offices. But what we didn't have was the alliances that we have now with all sorts of sectors. We didn't have the really strong philosophical agreement about the theoretical basis about what we were doing and why. And the strengths I see now are that we do have a lot of those things in place. We had some of the pillars there all that time ago. Not all of the ones we've got now, though. I think it's a great time at the moment.
It is indeed. Jess, what about you?
So I probably started working in this sector about 7 years ago, and I when I was employed, one of the roles that I had was to start the sexual assault prevention program for secondary schools in the Barwon region. And at that time, there really wasn't much around. That was seen to be kind of one of the leading programs to take on. And before I had come to Barwon Casa, a lot of work had been done to try and scope what should be done. I guess the background to that was that lots of schools were often coming to the service and had been over a number of years looking for kind of one-off, more response type stuff, and what had been decided at that time was that that wasn't the best way to go and that we needed to have a better response to that. But there might have been one or two other programs at the time, but there really wasn't a lot around. So
I've come a little bit later to respectful relationships in the piece. My last role was at the Department of Primary Cabinet, which at that time had the Women in Prevention portfolios when the Royal Commission was set up, and during the life of the Royal Commission, and I was there a bit after before I moved to education. So certainly, a lot of deep history before I came to it, but one of the great privileges of working and interacting so closely with the Royal Commission is I was able to see a lot of the evidence, hear from so many of the witnesses, and through that process hear the history of respectful relationships, of prevention and of family violence more broadly. So that was a fantastic, I mean, if you're going to get across the subject, a Royal Commission is a really good way to do it. And working in the Women of Prevention portfolios at that time, the Our Watch pilot was up and running. And there was a decision made at that time by government to put respectful relationships in the curriculum. So a hell of a lot was happening at that time, and it was fantastic to sort of deep dive into that, and also see how prevention, how respectful relationships was just so incredibly critical to the government's broader family violence reform agenda in partnership with the prevention sector and the response sector. So that's certainly something that the conversation in government has been. We know that there needs to be radical changes in service response. We know a lot of that's expensive. We know that's a lot of where the money goes. We know that goes to a lot of big systems, but prevention is the way that we're going to make sure that that this doesn't happen in the long term.
Well, due to my age, I suppose, my beginning with education in this area goes back 39 years when I began work as a 21-year-old teacher in a secondary school with a very challenged community with high rates of violence, very high rates of unplanned teen pregnancies, and a very young teaching force going, how do we help these kids? So it was a grand act of improvisation. Because back then there weren't the models, there wasn't the research, there wasn't the evidence base that we have now. However, it's when I began crafting the work that's been my whole life journey. But working in an education context as I have, it's also, gender wasn't at the forefront. So back then, as Pam has said, it might have been sexuality education or it was bullying, anti-bullying education, but not disaggregated to a focus on gender-based violence prevention. Or it was life skills, but now we have a science of social-emotional learning. But the other thing about working in the education sector is when gender was on the agenda, it wasn't next to violence. It was the 1980s when we had that great interest in catch-up by getting girls into science and maths education, which was largely successful, not entirely, we're still working on that. Then we had the big wave in the 1990s where the gender focus in schools was what's happening to boys. It was when literacy rates for boys began to plummet and we started to blame female teachers for that rather than the alternative data that says boys have stopped reading for pleasure, which remains true and unresolved. So then it's in this later wave around an education focus on gender has become the connection of gender with violence. So for me, this is quite a recent arrival in my career in the Australian setting because I've been very aware for the last more than a decade, certainly closer to 15 years, I've been working in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region or on the global scale with United Nations agencies who have been driving the focus on gender-based violence prevention way ahead of where most countries have had a country pickup rate. And I had more opportunities to pilot approaches to gender-based violence prevention in countries as different as Bangladesh and Philippines before getting the opportunity through government initiatives to actually do it back home here. So what I see very much is we're part of a global agenda, but gender keeps slipping and sliding into how it gets on the agenda in education. And we have to be very mindful about how we secure the focus that it has now, which is very different from the one it had in the past.
Thank you. I think it's a good reminder that we talk about gender and respectful relationships, particularly given there's such a strong focus on this issue now. We talk about it like it's something new, and it's really, really not. There's a whole lot of people who've been working on this in different contexts and in different fields, in different ways for many, many years. But I think in Victoria what we are recognising is that this is the first time we have tried to mainstream something before, to put something into a universal service system, which was done in a gender equity context previously to varying degrees across the country, but is new in education. So that with that kind of history of practice across both academic and community sectors, and increasingly in the school space now, can I ask each of our panellists to briefly reflect on some of the key milestones, particularly over the last 10 years in respectful relationships education in Victoria? Might go in reverse order this time. Helen, I'll start with you.
Well, funnily enough for me, some of the milestones don't carry the name gender-based violence prevention, because some of the key milestones in education have been that we've invested in prevention education at all. And what we had, first of all, was a key milestone preventing alcohol-related violence and alcohol risk behaviours through the National Mental Health Strategy and the Victorian Turning the Tide Strategy, which was a government initiative. Then we had the focus on mental health through prevention education programs. Again, a national strategy, but also a Victorian strategy. But I think if we hadn't had that evidence that we can actually make a difference through prevention education, we would not have been possible to argue that we can do this prevention education work in schools. What we've had is this accelerating evidence base and approach to using schools as a setting for prevention. And let's acknowledge all those fundings didn't come from education, they came from health or somewhere else. So it's about the education sector responding to drivers and imperatives from somewhere else. And so what I would say the key milestones are the preparedness of the education department to partner with the other sectors to do that work, which has never been comfortable or easy, though always agreed to be important.
Okay, thanks. What about you, Justin?
Okay. I think also about the evidence base, and just in government, when you're looking to get money for things or get traction and support for things, the evidence base is incredibly critical. So to think about in the last decade, the establishment of Our Watch, ANRO's work, some of the landmark pieces around the importance of prevention of family violence that Vic Health did a number of years ago. These are all things that are still invoked today in business cases and conversations in government. So there's an incredibly, that building of the evidence base. There are some of the formal organisations, but informed by so much of the work that prevention agencies, universities, response agencies have done over time. And I think for me, just the fact of the Royal Commission, so, being a bureaucrat, some of those milestones about, a government committing to a Royal Commission, having that process, and for us critically having a recommendation of a Royal Commission to implement respectful relationships in all government schools is just provides the foundation for everything that we're going to be doing.
And I think then ultimately probably the biggest milestone has been the department committing to actually taking on respectful relationships, because what I forgot to mention before was that when I started, my perspective and what seemed to be the perspective at the time, despite what had happened in the past that Pam had told me about, was that it was actually the community sector who was leading this work. And sometimes that was difficult, and sometimes, it was difficult to get schools on board, and we were really doing that. So when that then became something the Department of Education was doing and to be mandated across schools, I think that's really, really great and really important.
I think from a broader social perspective too, there's been the Royal Commission can't be overestimated, and also the social conditions that led to the Royal Commission. And I want to talk about there's the kind of social activism from people like Rosie Batty, and I think the influence of that in the popular culture can't be overestimated. We've got, instead of our issues and our processes being talked about in the health sector, in the community sector, in the school sector, they're now barbecue water cooler discussions, and they're in the public social space, the discussions about these kinds of things. So there's been a few of those crucial things that have come together to make the commitment, the work that we've got going on now so cohesive and so thorough.
Yeah. So that really strong focus, I think, is the kind of key theme that's coming through around the evidence base and the kind of the social and the cultural and the political context within which this has developed. And I think the interesting thing for me about the evidence base around respect for relationships is that it was a combination of a practice evidence base. I think we can often forget as we're talking about the last couple of years of the history of respect for relationships that some of this work was designed by Centres Against Sexual Assault. It was designed by Women's Health Services. It was designed by the people who were doing the work with victim survivors, who were starting to translate that into primary prevention and get a prevention lens into what it was they're doing. And so programs like the SAPS program that a number of the Centres Against Sexual Assault ran, or Girls Talk Guys Talk, which was a women's health service program, those are the models that have contributed to the evidence base that our Watch Pilot project drew from. And so we've just kind of had this really slow but steady sequential building of both practice and academic evidence in this space. Because historically the respect for relationships education had been championed and led really in a lot of contexts by a passionate prevention community sector, but as the evidence has developed, we've now got a whole school approach emerging as the most important element of any piece of work, and this is part of the DET rollout. So can I get you to think from your kind of a perspective of someone who's working within the centralised government who is rolling out respect for relationships and someone who has really got on the ground expertise, what the community sector's role now is in supporting respect for relationships work?
So I think, as Emily said, the whole school approach is the focus of so much of our attention. It's highly complementary to the curriculum elements, but it's really that focus of the Royal Commission's recommendation, that deep culture change in schools, and people might be familiar with the wheel diagram that we've got, and comes out of the Our Watch trial and pilot with 6 elements that are critical to making a whole school approach work, and they include things like commitment from the leaders of the school, making sure that the curriculum and in-classroom teaching is supported, but certainly community partnerships is a really critical piece of that. So that's and there's a number of our respect for relationships project leads and liaison officers in the room who are working with schools to help them embed all 6 of those elements. As some of the other panel members have said, and I'm newer to the world of education, but understand it's not always the most natural thing for a school to be working with community sector partners in their areas. I think it's something that's probably quite highly variable across the state. Under the implementation model we've got, I mentioned dedicated staff in DET's 17 regional area offices, and their role is to work with schools to help implement their model. But particularly one of those people in each of the areas is there to be helping schools to lift their capability in dealing with disclosures, but particularly forge those connections with family violence organisations. And we've had some really fantastic feedback that for schools, they can sometimes feel that when government and the department says, okay, you need to do this, we might produce a great, kind of glossy document, but it's really having someone that they can speak to and work with, and someone who's got a bit more of that expertise and can help facilitate the calls that really helps them. So I think we're on a journey, and I think I talked a bit about the local connections. I should also mention at the kind of statewide level and some of the conversations that happen in government about the design and implementation of big family violence initiatives and reforms that are happening. That's something where the peak organisations, DVRCV, members of the Family Violence Steering Committee, are absolutely having a major impact with government. Probably the thing that I've heard more than anything in working in family violence policy is make sure it's a genuine partnership between the family violence sector and government. There was an incredibly strong model that people point to 10 years ago when that was a highly collaborative thing, and it could not be more critical now when there's just an incredible amount of activity across government in family violence. So certainly I get the privilege of being part of some of those conversations at the most senior levels of government with people like Emily, people like Fiona McCormack, and others who are really making sure the family violence sector voice is heard.
I think it's a really important question, because one of the things that I saw happen when it was announced that the department would be taking on respect for relationships education is some of the community organisations who'd been doing really great work went, oh, well, no, there's not a role for us anymore, so we'll focus on something else. And I think there definitely really is an important role for the community sector to play there. I think there's a number of things, and it probably starts with connecting in with those staff that Justin was talking about, with the local DET staff who are working in the region, to see what they're doing, but also to be able to offer support from the different people I've met and the things I've heard. Those staff have a range of different experiences, and some have more experience around things like gender and some of the drivers and things than others. So I think there's probably roles in supporting staff and being someone that they can have those ongoing conversations with. As well as that, I think there's an important role in consultation with those staff in supporting schools and being able to be there and be quite flexible for schools in terms of the schools that are participating in the program, particularly what sorts of things might they need, because the DET staff are spread quite thin on the ground. They've got a lot of schools to work with. There's definitely going to be, I won't say that, I know there is schools who are definitely seeking lots of extra support, and I know some schools have struggled to get that. For instance, an example, I'm doing a little bit of work with a school who had said they'd approached some services who were going to charge them really high amounts of money to do some stuff around response. So I think it's being accessible to schools as much as you can, and knowing that you do have a really important role in being able to support both schools. And I think the other thing I've heard is that there's a lot of teachers who feel quite nervous about delivering teaching and learning materials, and I think there could possibly be a role for the community sector there in being able to offer schools just that little bit of extra support around that. And it definitely doesn't mean that you go in and do it, because that is not what we want to see. But there's lots of ways, I think, that staff who have had experience in doing those things in the past and know some of the issues that come up and questions and things like that could actually be a really valuable support to the staff who will now need to deliver that on the ground.
One of the things, I think, just talking about the evidence base, we do know how to prevent this work. And so, kind of Marion, you reminding us about what we are talking about here is family violence, and we are talking about violence against women. We know that in order to prevent violence against women, we need to address the 4 gendered drivers of this violence. And those are articulated and changed to this story. And we can't just address one of those drivers. We can't just go with the bit that we think is the easiest or fits the best. We actually have to make sure our work is sitting across all of those 4 drivers. But each of those drivers are unique and need a kind of unique response in and of themselves. We can't just do this work in a classroom or just do this work with teachers. It is a process of cultural change. So, Helen, can I ask you to reflect on what some of the challenges in helping young people in a classroom context are to understand the drivers, or all the 4 drivers of family violence?
The first thing I think we should say is the key driver is one absolutely critical to prevention education in general, doesn't matter what topic, and that is the challenge of the appropriate pedagogy, the appropriate kinds of learning strategies to use. If you use the wrong strategies, you get teachers preaching to kids, putting them aside, alienating them, push back, and you don't understand, miss, you just don't understand what it's like to be young now. You get a lot of resistance if you teach the wrong way. We know that if you want to change attitudes and health-related behaviours in education, whether they're sex-related, relationship violence, drug-taking behaviours, any risk behaviour, you have to use what we call collaborative learning strategies, which are interactive, peer-to-peer activities which involve both critical thinking about how things come to typically go the way they tend to do in our world, and what can we do to take them in a different direction. The what can we do is where it shifts to skills. So there's 2 very powerful types of learning strategies we have to use: critical thinking and skill development. They both require collaborative learning strategies. Our broader studies of what teachers tend to do in classrooms is they tend to favour one-on-one learning. So they're not specialists in collaborative learning. So we're actually enabling teachers to use powerful, effective pedagogies generically as their generic work, as well as work on this topic that has particular sensitivities as well. So we need to change practice styles as well as capacity with the content. So before we work with the children, we have to work with the teachers, because giving them a good model or a good resource is only one step in the way. However, we have other best friends in education to drive this change. We've got department investment in whole school approach to positive behaviour, whole school approach to literacy, whole school approach to the most recently released 10 high impact teaching strategies. These are the teaching strategies, we know these 10, they're the things that shift learning in general. Okay, very, very big evidence base around that. The nice thing is our Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships program kicks it in on every single one of the 10 as a best practice exemplar. If we could lift the game in education and go, if you were doing this work well, you would be practising out on doing any kind of teaching well. Let's get it to be best practice in teaching, or recognised as that, which it is, as well as best practice in prevention education. So in a way, we have to lift the level of debate to be truly education-centric in a very powerful way, as well as centric to the broader health and social and ethical outcomes that we want. And that way we will have schools recognising they're using their specialist skills in education to help society, and that's why they are the ones who have to do it. And they get their best friends in to help them with other stuff, but they have to lead this work. So this is a very serious investment, and we could harness the education best friends more powerfully, I think, than we do. It's a little hard when we've come from outside to do that, but if we don't do that, we won't get the results. We know from implementation studies, doesn't matter what kind of country, developing country, developed country, doesn't matter which health topic, the most common area of breakdown is in delivery of those collaborative learning strategies. So we should predict it and we should cater for it. And that's a little bit what Vic Health has been trying to do by also contributing to investing in learning, understanding that professional learning is at the heart of turning things around for kids in the classroom.
And so, Pam, from a community sector perspective then, what do you think some of the challenges are in getting a school system as a whole to understand and kind of take action on those 4 drivers?
I agree absolutely wholeheartedly with Helen about the fact that for this to stick in schools, it has to move into and be driven by the school sector and the Department of Education, which is happening. And there are some next steps that will be important to that. And that is, getting it embedded in the normal processes. So that's not a new thing. It's in all the school improvement processes. It's in all the, the staff attitude surveys. So it's not a separate one on the side. It becomes embedded, and that's, I think, we'll be working towards that in the next little while.
My question's for Helen, but also any of the other panellists that want to comment. So obviously, you know a lot about the way that young people learn, and especially in the context of social emotional learning and respectful relationships. I'm wondering in your work if you've ever drawn any comparisons between educational theory and organisational change theory and social change theory. I think given that schools are essentially places of teaching and learning, but they're also complex communities and complex organisations, and I'm wondering if we know about how those things, those two kind of processes might coalesce more effectively.
Yeah, there is a really good crossover between the fields of research where we research school change and school effective development more generally, particularly through the school leadership research and the school effectiveness research, who are both specialist areas. One of the things those bodies of research distinguish is the power of community of learners approaches. So, for example, if you want staff to change their practices, they need to do that with other staff, supported by a couple of things: strong moral drivers in the school, effective leadership, opportunities to learn through identifying where they need to change, learning from evidence, trialling things, working together to see how does what we do differently with grade 3 turn out to better practice, and working in a community of learners, so that the kind of community connectedness of school change is as important as the things we do in the classroom where we try to drive peer-related change, again through community and social learning. So there's a lot of crossover in that area. But there's also another field of research that investigates what we call cascade training. That is when we go and give a whole lot of training to some people who are supposed to train on to others, to others, to others, and it goes down the waterfall. And then the people who are actually going to do it get the less training of all, all right? It's called cascade training. It's a really lousy model. The research says it doesn't work. The people down there at the grassroots level need the most input, and what they get the most benefit from in this field is exactly what we've learned from even the feedback we've had from all the 26 days of training we've just rolled out recently, is they learn best from sampling the learning activities they're actually going to teach. So in other words, the teachers have kind of the same learning needs as the kids to sit in the learning activities and work out, do the work themselves on their own social emotional competencies and gender attitudes and skills, and then take a step up and go, and then how do we teach effectively about that? So it's almost like the babushka dolls. You know, it's the same pattern all the way out, from the system level right down to the micro level of the classroom. So effective teaching and effective modes of fostering community-based learning are inherent in this social change initiative, is the way I would see it, without giving you 93 lectures that you probably don't want to hear. Okay.
Yeah, just to add to what Helen said again, totally agree. But one of the things that we'll be looking closely at in our project is that what you're referring to, Joel, and that's organisational change model, and how that's rolling out and how that's working in schools. For instance, some schools, the lead schools in particular, are further down the track with this work, and some dived in straight away. Some of the others that we're working with have time to be a bit more thoughtful about their engagement with their own staff and with their school community. So, and we can see that that's going to be crucial in how the whole thing works, to have that process to engage and to become, first of all, to understand why we need to do the work, to get the skills to do the work, to practice the skills to do the work, and then to do it together. So that's one of the things we're really keenly looking at. And a whole lot of schools, as you know, are in a whole lot of different spaces there. But that'll form an interesting part of what we're currently doing.
Just a quick question with regard to the word gender, and some of the schools that I've been working at, particularly in the primary area. And an example, we piloted some of the teaching and learning materials last year at this school, and put out a letter, detailing some of the topics that we were covering, and there was absolutely no parent buy-in at all from it. It went through smooth sailing, through school council, everything. A similar letter's gone home this year, and the school leadership has been completely bombarded to the point where there was 3 or 4 days where the principal was completely out of action, fielding calls from parents. And a lot of it being linked to the propaganda stuff that's floating around Facebook and other sources. But I've recently been made aware of a woman going around having morning teas with people, talking about respectful relationships and parents' concerns about it in their homes. And just how the word, like I'm finding a lot of the primary schools, sorry, she tries to upstage me, terrified of putting the word gender in it. They're really happy to do all of the work exactly as it's laid out in the things, but they keep saying, can we just try and avoid that word, because at the moment it's a dirty word, for want of a better word. Do you have any advice to give those schools? Yeah.
I just want to say that let's be a little bit more forthright about where this resistance could be coming from. In the Resilience, Rights and Respectful Relationships program, we include gender as a very generous, the full term for all gender identities. So we do teach about diversity, and we actively teach for the inclusion of approaches, anti-violence approaches and respectful approaches to LGBTIQ young people. So it's a lot easier to get community agreement to say, let's stop family violence, though there's still unrest and resistance. But we have a lot of fear-mongering and hate speech going on in our community around gender more generally. Now, you can't disaggregate in a school and teach kids it's all right not to be violent to some people, but you can be violent to others. No, we can't disaggregate in that way. So that was the principle by which we took this inclusive approach in this resource, and it is there whether mischief is being done in the community. And so what we have is schools who haven't been well supported yet to understand that they are doing human rights work of great importance when they are teaching in this way. So we've had a sort of a loss of the human rights aspects in this gender debate, and I think it doesn't help if we segregate off talking about gender into lots of different baskets. In schools, everyone needs to be safe, everyone needs to be respected, regardless of any form of diversity. So it needs to sit in a broad school approach to that as well, and I think that is where the community sector is very, very valuable, because schools are increasingly sort of a convenient site of attack, a convenient site of people making declarations that are false but insisting they're true. And it is nice for the school principal or the school community to have non-insiders coming in and saying, well, actually, I know you're hearing some of this, but that's not everyone. You know, there's other people out here, we're with you, we can help you with this. This is the resistance you get when you're going through a period of great change and social upheaval. And resistance is an indicator that you're on the money, you're heading somewhere. I would suggest the thing we most need to give schools to enable that work with principals and their team, which is their staff, is we have to actually acknowledge this takes time, and that means staffing. It doesn't mean that little top-up grant you get to do some extra work in your school. That does not buy staff time. You need to, unlike every other organisation under the sun, you've got no middle-level managers in schools because they're all teaching all the time. So they can never meet together, so they can never do the talking work of change. So if you actually want to change a workforce in schools, you need to give them some extra staffed time so you can have some of them released from the classroom, a proportion of their day sufficient unto what it takes to lead the change in their school. So that's why when we talk about an education sector needing to do health and community work, it needs to show up in investment in staff time. So otherwise we end up demonising teachers and schools as if somehow their capacity is missing rather than it's under-resourced.
Yes, so actually a couple of questions spring to my mind. Just following on from what we just talked about just now would be the aspect of vicarious trauma on teachers, you know, when they're already, their capacities can be pretty stretched, is then, you know, what happens then personally when there's comments, like particularly around the pornographic influence comments, you know, for any teacher, the impact on the teacher's capacity around vicarious trauma. So that's one question I have, and how do we support teachers? And also then, you know, and the stress on the workforce around that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, health and wellbeing support for principals, that's absolutely a massive focus of the department. In the last couple of years, the regional officers and regional staff of the department have been boosted right back up after dropping off in previous years. And there are multidisciplinary health and wellbeing teams in each of those 17 areas, with the respectful relationship staff being part of and working alongside those. They are there to help schools with health and wellbeing practice, deal with the really complex cases. Separately to that, there's also a big focus on actually supporting a principal or supporting staff with stress, with really kind of complex issues that they might be facing. Specifically on family violence, one of the other recommendations that relates to the Department of Education is establishing a family violence principal practitioner role. So that person is Malia Dews, and she's in the department's regional services group. So certainly part of her role and more broadly in the health and wellbeing area is to say what are the specific things that principals need when they're hearing from families about disclosures of family violence, these confronting topics that we're talking about here, when staff are dealing with it as well. If they might have a base level of knowledge about safety frameworks for children and for staff in their school, but they're hearing about circumstances and specific unique dynamics of family violence that are new. And one of the practical things is some workplace contact officers, a network of those being built up to have someone that principals can call.
I think this is really important, and I think it's acknowledging that for schools, the first step is acknowledging this is not like teaching maths, science, English. This is actually an area where, like you're saying, vicarious trauma could easily be something that occurs, and even if it's not to that level, it's really difficult to deal with that sort of stuff, and it's taken all of us who've worked in this field many years to be able to build up ways to deal with that. I think probably there's there's probably lots of things, but a few I'll mention is I would hope that the liaison officers within the department would see that as part of their role, to actually be linking schools in with services, not just around referral for students and families, but also to provide someone for teachers to speak to. I certainly know all of the services I've worked at, there was definitely secondary consultation. So they would all be fine with a teacher ringing up saying, hey, we had this conversation in class today, I just want to have a chat about it. So I think the resources are probably there. It's just about schools really making sure that they're linking into them, and if they haven't been linked into them in that way, perhaps asking their liaison officers, what can we do about this, who can we call? There's obviously also the 1-800 RESPECT, which is 24/7. So there's lots of tools there. It's just actually about linking into them.
We're almost at the close. I just want to ask all of our panellists one last question before we finish. And it's a bit of a forward-looking question over the next year. So Victoria really is not only a country leader, but a world leader when it comes to respect for relationships. So what is one thing that you would like to see happen in the next 12 months to kind of push us into that global leadership space?
The one thing is more time, and a subset of that is more resourcing, because we've got an unprecedented level of resourcing at the moment. We've got a huge upswell, we've got a great deal of enthusiasm, we've got a rapidly developing workforce, we've got forums like this that are discussing these issues at a high level, we've got great input here from the Department of Education and a huge amount of partnership, we've got continuous development of the evidence base. We need more time. We're only at the start of it for most schools that we've been dealing with, and it would be a real shame not to have that.
I'm just going to jump on the global level, and I'm going to suggest we need to take this sort of giant selfie so that the organisation can actually see how terrific what they've done is, and take their defensive hat off, understand that the work is absolutely producing joy and change as well. So teachers are loving teaching these materials. And when I say global level, there is almost no other country in the world that has a K-10 curriculum for prevention of gender-based violence, let alone one that's generous enough to share it free of charge with anyone who wants to go get it. So I'm really looking forward at the United Nations have a global working group on the prevention of school-related gender-based violence, which will be scheduled in Senegal in a month's time, and I'll be sharing about this here because they think what Victoria's doing is remarkable. I just think Victoria needs to start to see it is a world leader, and that would help pull other actions into train. Like, well, of course we're going to keep investing in it. We're not only a world leader in sport, we're a world leader in gender-based violence prevention. And so once we start to identify and have a name for what it is we're doing and speak from that, I do think there's a different kind of press, a different kind of talk that can go on in the community, a different kind of talk that can go on in the sector around getting funding, and it is a whole different way to harness the next phase of action. So let's go get ourselves a medal from somewhere and stick it on. So, and a giant selfie. Okay.
What a lovely way to finish. Please thank our wonderful panel for speaking so articulately.